took a toll. But yeah, to everyone else, he was incredible. Hey, come on in, have a seat anywhere. Let's call Borko in. We'll do that.
Oh, yeah.
Some people walked in since we did it. I'm just gonna start because also the camera's rolling on us. But hey everyone, welcome to the event. I go by Kino online. I'm a Sopranos YouTuber. I wanted to put this together to just kind of have a general kind of discussion and chat about our favorite show, the thing that brought us all together here, The Sopranos. We're gonna discuss some stuff, but if you guys have any questions or stuff that you want to talk about, feel free to shout it out. It's a very open format here. But let's do. I know we introduced them, so let's just do it again one more time. So these are my two guests here, also Sopranos content creators. So you want to introduce them?
Sure. My name is Stephanie. Sopranos Blueprint on YouTube. I also have a Sopranos blog. I actually watched The Sopranos only for the first time a little over 4 years ago, and then never stopped watching, essentially. So
Took over your life.
Basically, but in a good way. I definitely spend more time on it probably than I should, but it's it's a great hobby and passion of mine, and something that I really enjoy, and especially getting to talk with you all and meet you all, meet fellow like-minded fans. So I'm happy to be here.
And I'm Mac from Macabre Storytelling. It's funny you mentioned that. I was going to ask, we could go around and ask people, when did you get introduced to it? It was I think my sophomore year of college, and I remember because I bought the first season on iTunes. Remember you could do
that?
Can you still do that? I don't know if that's still a thing. The iTunes store, you could buy shows.
Yeah.
And that was when I first watched the first season. I don't know what brought it on. And I actually think I didn't. I think I left it after the first season.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows, the first couple seasons is sort of the tonally it kind of shifts as the show goes on. And I think the first season was good, but it didn't really grab me as much.
Yeah.
And then I rewatched it years later, and then I was like, oh shit, this is actually good stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna call in Borko. Guys don't know who Borko is. He's got the biggest channel, Sopranos channel ever. Posts a bunch of clips. He's a great guy. I've had him on my podcast before. He's from Serbia. He's gonna call in and say a few words. Let me go set that up.
He's gonna get him out on the line with Junior.
Yeah, he's a boss.
The Taliban.
Exactly.
I've always wondered if, at one point, he probably will post the whole show, right? Every scene. I can only imagine. And then I wonder if he could just, post a whole playlist of the entire series, just all the way through.
That would be helpful if someone can't stream it. They can just go to his channel.
That's basically what I did at some point. I'll get into, a rhythm of just, watching a Sopranos clip, and then I'll just keep doing it over and over and over. And then I kind of realized I watched at least 2 episodes worth of content in a row. I'm like, oh wow, that's a little bit.
Yeah, that's sort of me too. Just
Hey.
What's up, Borko?
I can hear you perfectly.
Perfect.
Hey, so I know you can't see, but we're here at the event. Let me, I can show you. We got a little bit of a crowd here.
Hello.
Everyone, this is Borko. You're going to have to just look at me and talk to me, Borko. But we're here at the event. The Sopranos content creator event. I've got an audience, and I just wanted to bring you on. I know it's late there in Serbia where you're at. But I'd love for you to just kind of introduce yourself to this crowd and tell everyone who you are.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, for your invitation. It's an honor. Glad to meet all of you. I'm Borko from Serbia. I upload Sopranos on YouTube, short videos, small compilation for 6 years now. Some of you might know me, and yeah, I'm a huge fan, obviously, even though it's been a while since I rewatched the series. And not much to say.
We went around a little bit before you joined, and we kind of talked about how we got into the show. Tell everyone how you first discovered The Sopranos and why it grabbed to the point where you now have the biggest Sopranos YouTube channel on YouTube.
Well, it was a pure coincidence. Actually, when James Gandolfini died, I had no idea to be honest, we not even watched The Sopranos. I knew that was a guy from a few movies that I watched, but I thought it was actually a show about some singers. And then, actually, I was at the time, that was 2013, summer of 2013, actually, August, exactly like now. Breaking Bad, I was watching Breaking Bad, and it had a break during the season 5, and I needed something to watch. And I started watching The Sopranos. Initially, I didn't like it at all. If the episode 5 was episode 4, and the episode 4 was episode 5, I don't know if we would probably wouldn't do it at all. So yeah, I don't know what more to tell you. It's a legendary TV show, like we all know, that we all love. That is practically at this point immortal. 17 years after the last episode, people are still talking. It is even possible that the Sopranos are now, let's say, hotter than ever, in my opinion. You see how popular the videos are, how popular the topics on Reddit are, how popular YouTube channels are, everything. It's 2024, like, 20 years after. Amazing.
Can you guys hear that? Like, is it coming through clearly?
So, yeah.
Okay. We might have a little bit of audio issues here, Borko. Maybe you can talk a little bit closer to the mic.
Okay.
Does anyone here? Hey, come on in. Thank you. We only have Borko for a limited time. Does anyone here have any questions they would like to ask him or anything they'd like to say? Otherwise, I have a couple topics, but.
What's his favorite season?
Borko, we have a question from the audience. What's your favorite season of the show?
My favorite season is actually season 6. Very unpopular opinion, but I don't know. I just love practically everything except for Junior going crazy. It was like a major blow to the entire show, but they really like season 6.
What's your favorite episode? I guess we get to or in general, but of season 2.
I don't know. Oof. If I had to pick one, it would be Meadowlands, season 1, episode 4.
Meadowlands from season 1 is your favorite episode?
Meadowlands, yes.
Okay.
If I had to pick one, even though it's extremely difficult,
Okay, I got you.
Practically impossible.
Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to shout them out.
How did you first get into, or what made you sort of, decide to start posting the clips on YouTube?
One of our guests, Mac from Macabre Storytelling, asks, what made you first start posting the clips on YouTube?
I don't know how to describe it. Again, a pure coincidence. Well, a bit embarrassing actually. I was having a bit much to drink that night, and I couldn't sleep. And I was like, okay, I know how to edit videos. Why not try uploading let's say, Sopranos? And pure coincidence. I don't know how it happened. It just happened. And I don't know, just today, there was a subscriber, number 650,000. It's not bad. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. I have a question for you. So, you started a Discord. That's a relatively new thing, and it is the most active Sopranos community out there. I see people posting constantly. What has that been like for you to have that, create that kind of online community there for Sopranos?
Well, it's I don't know. It's not that great, to be honest. There's a lot of Sopranos servers out there, and not everyone can like you. I learned that on Discord, so it's better to we can talk about YouTube or the show, of course.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Borko, how much do I owe you? Because people, they like to comment on my videos saying I better be keeping up to Borko. So I feel like I owe you some. I owe you something.
Okay. So,
No.
Stephanie from Sopranos Blueprints, was another one of our guests, is asking, how much money does she owe you? Because everyone on YouTube says they have to kick up to the boss. About Sopranos is you.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, that is just a mean nothing. I don't know how it started, to be honest. During the COVID lockdown, it actually became a very popular meme for some reason, as well as some other things related to HBO. So even 4 years later, more than 4 years later, it's still going on every video, and I'm still to other channels. Just the way it is, nothing I can do about it. Sorry. And thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other comments?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does he think Tony died in the final episode? And if he did, who killed him?
Okay. So one of the people in the audience asks, do you think Tony died in the ending? And if so, who do you think killed him?
Yes, of course. There is no doubt in my mind, and who ordered the hit was, in my opinion, again, we talked about it once or maybe even 2 times. When me, my opinion, it was Carmen Lupertazzi Jr.
You hear that? Carmine Lupertazzi Jr.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what he thinks.
Oh,
it is.
okay.
He's smart.
Someone in the audience asks, do you have any rakia?
Do I have rakia? I stopped drinking almost 3 years ago. I had, not anymore.
Okay. All right, Borko. We're going to let you go here because I know it's getting late. Do you have any final stuff you'd like to say to the audience here?
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you, and I actually have a question for you. Are you streaming this somewhere?
I'm recording it on the camera, so I'll post it as a video later on YouTube, and I'll let you guys know when it's posted. But yeah, it's going to be on YouTube later.
Okay, thank you so much. It was my pleasure to join this call, and thank you to all.
Thank you so much for everything you've done for the Sopranos community, because you pretty much created the Sopranos YouTube space that we have today. So we owe you a debt. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Oh, no. Okay, thank you so much. I mean, it's flattering. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kino. Goodbye.
So I think they were trying to set this up as one possibility, because there's a lot of possible ways the finale could have gone. You've got the guy in the members only jacket. You've got those guys who come in and they're checking out like the pastries and stuff.
Unidentified black men.
Yeah, black guys. There's a lot of different angles. Like Paulie, when he's leaving Tony for the last time, he looks like really guilty about something. Butchie's a possibility, like Carmine Jr. What do you guys think? Like, what's your take on the ending? Yeah, go for it.
I saw a video one time that theorized that Patsy might have had something to do with it.
Patsy's another one.
Kind of never had any respect for Tony.
Yeah, I mean, he hated him because of what happened with his brother, Spoons.
And then Tony didn't pick him as capo.
Didn't pick him as capo. I wonder, my only argument against Patsy is his son is about to marry Tony's daughter. Is this the best time for him to take him out? Is that a good move? If I was him, I'd kind of wait and solidify my position for a little while. He's obviously, because Tony was going to pick him over Paulie if Paulie didn't take the captainship of the Aprio crew. He's like, Patsy's my family now. I'll put him in there. So, from a business sense, I thought there was opportunities to stick with Tony at least for a while. But I could see why he would hate him though. Still,
I think the fact that he was in the car with Syl. That's the other thing that Glenn makes me doubt that Patsy was sort of in it, because he could have easily been shot too. But I could also see Patsy being sort of, almost like going with the flow. Like, he doesn't really have any loyalty to Tony, so if Tony's fine, okay. But, like, if Tony got taken out, I don't think Patsy would have been, like, necessarily crying. Like, I think he would have.
So we're all in agreement that he dies in the finale. That's what the finale is. Does anyone have any argument against that? Because people do get, like, animated about, like, no, he didn't die.
I don't have any argument against it, but I did see this one really compelling video on YouTube about how all three of them, Carm and AJ, were all killed, and all the way down to the two football paintings of football players that represented the calibers of the gun that each shooter used, because there were two shooters. Remember the one jacket and the other guy? Then how there was they took Holy Communion with onion rings and soda that's made in America, and all this other kind of stuff. But I don't know. I think it's probably the most compelling argument I've heard. I reckon all three of them probably did get killed.
Oh, you think so?
I think so.
Yeah.
But,
you think all three? You said?
And then did you think when Meadow walked in? That's when they were shooting.
Yeah, because she was like guardian angel.
Yeah.
That William Burroughs thing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I love about The Sopranos. There's so many different layers to it. Even with I feel like Seven Souls is a perfect just illustration in itself of just how just all over the place The Sopranos is.
Okay, so maybe you know this because you were around when the filming. I mean, people read a lot of details into the background of Holston's at the time. I don't know if you ever saw Holston's. Was that just how it was?
I think that's. I'm pretty sure where that is.
I've been to Holston's. I had a little vlog where I went there, and it looks completely different. They have a bunch of pictures of David Chase and the actors there. I got to even sit in the same booth right there where Tony was, and I ordered the onion rings. But it looks, I always wondered, I imagine a lot of that stuff was just at Holston's, that's just how the restaurant is.
To answer your question, to my understanding, that mural with the house in the back, that kind of looks like the family mansion that Tony visits during his coma dream. That was specifically commissioned by David Chase.
Yeah, really?
I believe, and also the tiger.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay, because that's not there anymore. So maybe that was original to David Chase.
I think that's supposed to be the tiger. Obviously, I think a representation of Adriana, along with the cat. It's kind of supposed to be this. I think this idea of everything's kind of coming back to haunt him in a way.
I've come around on that cat being Adriana, though.
What about the Schrodinger's cat? The theory, Schrodinger's equation. I kind of think of that with the whole finale, remember John Schwinn in the hospital when he's it's physics, Schrodinger's equation. And so Schrodinger's equation, it's this idea that something can be alive and dead at the same time, but you wouldn't know. And and then there's a cat is the example that the actual physicists use.
Oh, yeah.
So it's I mean, of course, you could go down a bunch of rabbit. You could go down a lot of rabbit holes.
There's also the fact that Tony has a tiger tattoo on his shoulder. We don't see it that often in this, and I always thought that was a little weird that he had that tattoo. It didn't scream mafioso to me.
Was he a Detroit fan? Yeah,
I don't know, but I mean that's going way back to season 1 though. So you'd have to be did he plan it out that far? I don't think so. David said he never planned out the ending until they got to season 6. Because he's from old school television where you never knew whether you were getting another season or not. And HBO especially, they like to hold negotiations for a long time so they can get less money and screw over the actors. But yeah, there's so many details of that finale. Obviously, there's the details that everyone knows, the bell and the callback. You probably don't even hear it when it's coming. Members only jacket from the beginning of the season. Does everyone think that the members only guy if he died, that guy was the shooter?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was there in another toothpick. He was with Officer Leon Wilmore. I think it was the same guy. With Officer Leon Wilmore, when Tony went to, remember, he got the officer reassigned, and so then he's walking. Fountains of Wayne, that was the name of the store. Yeah. And so when Tony's walking up to the store, there's this guy that Leon Wilmore is like helping, and I think it's the members only guy, but I don't know if it's actually meant to be, or if it just so happens he was an actor that was on that episode, and then he ended up getting called back later to play
I doubt
the
they
episode.
planned that, but maybe they called back that guy to be like, oh, you've seen this guy before. It's totally possible.
So what would you guys say? Because I'm curious to hear you two, because I was a bit surprised you guys mentioned the Patsy theory. I 100% believe the Patsy, or for me, it's Patsy and Paulie conspired to take out Tony. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that, and it has a lot to do with Carlo. There's a lot of stuff going on in the finale I think is very peculiar.
I think Paulie's 100% involved. He looks so guilty afterwards. And he also, remember, when he was talking, when in season 4, when they were having problems with the Lupertazis, he was telling Johnny Sack, like, hey, you know, if I'm the boss afterwards, I'll kind of be okay with this. Not that he was in a position to be at that point, but I think he wanted to take Tony out and be the boss.
He was so, ever since Paul, and I love Paulie, by the way, but Paulie was a total snake. I mean, ever since season 1, at the end of season 1, he's like, you know, how does that sit with you about Tony seeing a woman psychiatrist?
Yeah.
And he's like, Erica, don't compute with me. So even all the way back in season 1, I feel like he was showing that in a way he wasn't really loyal, and then still had to sort of put him down, like, what are you getting at, Paulie? And then, of course, you know, then everything happens when he gets pissed off with Tony. I mean, I feel like with Paulie, I don't think that Paulie really had any loyalty to anyone but Paulie, but that might be why he stayed alive until the end, because...
I mean, that's the point with all the mobsters. Like, none of the... I mean, arguably, you could say Syl had loyalty, but going back to the Adriana thing, who here thinks Christopher was a rat? Because that's a okay, you think so? There's a theory that he's a... I talked about this in one of my videos, but he's all pissed off against Tony and towards the last few episodes before he dies. He's wearing a hat in the last episode, which was the same thing that Jack Mazzarone had the hat, where he had the wire. And where I used to think that the orange cat at the end was Adriana, because she always wore a bunch of cat stuff, and she had the whole meow thing. But I've kind of come around to it being like Christopher. And the reason because of that is he's staring at the picture of Christopher, and Tony says there's a rat behind there. And that, in a way, could mean that Christopher was... He was talking about ratting to JT Dolan right before he shoots him. He's like, you know how much I could give the feds if I wanted to go out to Arizona.
The whole castle could come down.
I was like, I never thought about that till I was researching that video, but I'm like, there's some stuff here that he might be a rat. They never show it, and I always am like, if they didn't show it, you know, how much are we supposed to take from that? But, you know, I'm about 50-50 now. I think there could be some evidence there.
Great. Show of hands, who thinks Meta was pregnant in the finale?
Possible.
I've never heard that. What's that theory?
Wait, really?
I've never heard that.
She switched birth control, because she was on her way to that switch birth control, which then means there's an automatic, basically, like, period of time where before it's going to be effective. That might just be a woman thing that I know.
Yeah.
Which I don't really know why she was, which I don't even know, because, but it also kind of would be a callback to college where she admitted that she did crystal meth, and he's like, you're not pregnant, are you? Yeah. And so it's kind of almost like a coming full circle sort of thing.
So there's a scene, it's in, because I remember, that's actually my favorite episode, Mr. and Mrs. Acrimony request.
That's a grandchild.
It's when they're sitting at the table and Tony says, after what I've been through, having your kids is very important to me. So there's this sort of like theme of like grandchildren, of Tony sort of coming around. And in the final episode, I think, because the actual mobster that Tony is based off of was actually a rat. He was an informant in real life. And technically, you could say that Tony was already technically a rat in the finale because he was making deals with the FBI. Something that, funny enough, Paulie would be keen on because he was there with him in that final scene when he's talking with the FBI agent. When they're in the parking lot, that might factor into my theory on the finale. Yeah. So the big thing is like Tony, it's this sort of him being a grandfather, and that's sort of like making him reevaluate his life. And Yeah, I think the key is that when we think about the finale, we're talking about like the final episode of this like huge hit show. So I think every single piece of dialogue is meant to interpret something. That was a very strange line of, oh, she's the doctor switching birth control.
Right, like almost like it's not something that would just like, why would and David Chase, especially since he was, he wrote last episode.
Yeah.
So especially although he probably wouldn't admit it, because like just like with every theory, I think he likes to kind of pretend like, what the hell are these people talking about? When people asked him like on like Talking Sopranos, I know Stephen Michael been like tried to like ask him about different theories and be like, what are they talking about? I don't think he would actually ever say like what.
You gotta take what he says in interviews a little bit of a grain of salt, though. I don't think he remembers all the stuff.
He
from
doesn't.
The Sopranos.
He doesn't.
He's talked about stuff that I'm like, how is that your interpretation of that scene?
David Chase, do you think there's a little bit of just like not hatred, but like Japanese hatred for the fans a little bit? He's like,
oh yeah.
I don't think he hate. I think hatred's a strong word. I think he's contemptuous of television. If you know anything about his background, he hated TV. Mm-hmm. He worked in the studio system. It was terrible. And The Sopranos, why it's so good, it was his rebellion against TV. But he has always wanted to be like this auteur, like filmmaker type guy, which is funny because he's only ever had 2 films. One, Not Fade Away, which I think is a really good film. If you guys have never seen that movie, it's not anything to do with mafia, although James Gandolfini is in the film. But it's about like a rock and roll teen in New Jersey in the 1960s. Very much autobiographical to David Chase. And then he had The Many Saints of Newark, which did not do so well. So it's so funny that he found this incredible success in television, the medium that he kind of hated. I don't think he hated it completely, but he definitely wanted to be in the film world, and that's why The Sopranos has this very like cinematic like quality where it's not really like a soap like episode to episode. It's more so like individual little movies, and I think that's why it's so good.
Mm-hmm. I always think when Carmela when they're about to watch Citizen Kane and she reads the review, she's like, a film that broke all the rules and invented some new ones. And I always think about like if you inserted like TV show into that, it would be like The Sopranos, like a TV show that broke all the rules. And
if you remember when JT Dolan he's relapsing, he's trying to sell his Emmy, and he's like, nah, I can't do it, man. If it was an Oscar, maybe, like very much poking fun at the television market.
There was a quote I think I mentioned in one of my Seinfeld video that I found from Chase, where what pissed him off the most about The Sopranos was that throughout the entire show, everyone's kind of because he wrote Tony as like someone you weren't supposed to emulate. He wrote him as someone who was supposed to be a bad guy. You in your video on college, you discussed that how he fought for Tony killing Fabian at the end because they didn't want to. It's like, no, this is a bad guy. He's supposed to be a person who's capable of this. And as the show goes on, everyone's all, it's like, yeah, man, Tony's the man. He's so cool. And it kind of pissed Chase off a little bit. He's like, well, no, hang on. He's not supposed to be a hero. But then come the final season, what he said was all of a sudden, all these people who have been cheering him on for 6 seasons, all of a sudden they're like, yeah, I can't wait till he gets killed because of all the bad stuff. And he's kind of, I think he felt the resentment against the audience of sort of using him as sort of a power fantasy, but then come the end, all of a sudden, oh, well, now he's the bad guy, so he has to die.
That's interesting. I could see that in terms of him wanting it to be, because I feel like he really did get towards the end. Like, I think of the episode Chasing It is like a prime example where it was just like, you are a really shitty person. Like, it's just in terms of, I mean, when you compare like his relationship with Hesh in season 1, season 6.
What I love about that episode is a lot of it's like filmed on like that has like a shaky cam kind of effect to it, and I think that's meant to mirror his like mental state where he's like completely lost it. He's become the degenerate gambler that his father told him not to be.
And owed Hesh money, just like Mahaffey owed Hesh money. Yeah,
and he's slowly destroying all his relationships. But it's funny that you said that about David Chase. On one of his interviews, I think on Talking Sopranos, he said that like Tony did not get any worse from the pilot to the end, and I mean, maybe you could argue he meant that he was that bad to begin with, but I'm like, from a storytelling perspective, no, it got way worse by the end.
I almost sort of wonder if it sort of had like Breaking Bad syndrome in a bit, where the creator of the piece sort of has a more negative outlook on the character. They sort of are like, because like, I think if you ask Vince Gilligan, he would say it's like, yeah, Walter's he was always sort of this very angry, frustrated person who kind of used his near-death experience to sort of be able to live out a power fantasy. Yeah. And he was kind of using his, providing for his family. And I would actually argue that it's pretty evident even in the first season, like when he doesn't accept Elliot.
Well, hold on, wait. This is a Sopranos thing. Has anyone not seen Breaking Bad? It doesn't want spoilers. We asked at the beginning if everyone's seen The Sopranos, right? Okay, everyone's seen Breaking Bad.
But basically, it's sort of, I think for Vince Gilligan, he sort of viewed Walter as like, no, this kind of was always sort of a bad guy who was this like very bitter man. But then he saw a lot of fans who were kind of like, they were kind of like hardcore stans. They were like, no, man, he just had to do what he had to do. He had to provide for his family almost more than he intended. And I almost wonder if that's sort of what Chase meant, where he viewed Tony as sort of always this sort of like man-child, even despite his positive attributes that he did display, he kind of always viewed him as a very bad person. Or maybe I think this is also another issue where he may have underestimated the impact that when a character does something in television or like in a movie, we kind of don't, because Tony openly kills people several times, like even in the first season, but when we're watching it, if anyone murdered someone in real life, we would be like, oh, that's horrifying. Well, but when we're watching it, it doesn't really kind of sink in. We don't really,
because there's humor to it, especially in the first season, really all the way up through the end, it gets less humorous. But even the kills, particularly in season 1, there's a lot of comedy to it.
He pulls the gun out of the fish's mouth.
When they throw Rusty Irish off the bridge, and even with Jimmy Altieri, why don't you call him help on your radio, Mike?
Yeah.
So I feel like that's I think that also helps.
I think he's talked about that before. That definitely the show makes you like these guys, but they're in real life they would be complete And I think towards the end they also showed that a lot with not just the murder stuff, but just how they interact with each other, constantly undermining Chris when he's trying to be sober and talking about his daughter. It's it's fun from a little bit of a distance, but when you're actually in that moment watching them all laugh at you, it's no, this is very hurtful. Or again with Chris when he's coming back from the Uncle Pat's farm, he's crying, this guy's a murderer, but bullying still hurts you even when you're a grown ass man like that.
But yeah, that last season, though, I think it was almost more of I don't know if it was Chase's fuck you to the audience, but I definitely think it was this is the time when we really have to drive, when he beat up Perry, chasing it, even Sopranos home movies, you just kind of get this
fire. When he makes Bobby, when they just spoken in the boat, how he hadn't ever had to kill one, and it's a pain in the balls because of DNA, and then he has, which I guess another subject, but I think if Bobby hadn't been killed, he got it because the guy, I think Bobby got some of his blood or some of his stuff on the dead guy because the guy pulled Bobby's collar when he killed him. Yeah. So I could see, I guess that's another subject, but.
I also wonder too because even if you go back to season 1, and this was Chase's justification for Tony killing Fabian was that even if the audience does view him as a murderer, they're going to respect him because for whatever you say about Tony in season 1 is you kind of almost have to begrudgingly respect his devotion to this thing of theirs. He was very and the fact that he went out of his way to do it because he believed in the honor of this is what we have to do. And it's a bit strange where you almost sort of respect that he's kind of got that loyalty to his cause. And that's what he laments in the pilot is that everyone else seems that doesn't exist anymore. But then, as you guys point out, come the final season, there's just none of that. He betrays his friends. And ends up writing to the FBI something that he probably would kill himself if the other person, if he found out he did, when he kills Christopher, this person who, for all of Christopher's faults, he was loyal to, or should have been loyal to, and then after he kills him, he's like, fuck yeah, I should have done that a long time ago.
Yeah.
We start to see, and then it makes you, and I think this goes back to Chase's comments, it makes you look back on how much of this was Tony, was this stuff he actually believed, was this who he really was, or was it all sort of a show?
Or what he wanted, sort of like with the thing with Artie, where he's like, you see 20 steps ahead in terms of like wanting bad things to happen. So I think what you're saying about Christopher kind of goes back to the ride when Tony's like, oh, you should have some wine, like, for your kid, like, moderation. We're like, then look what that led to. Then he has a huge, heroin relapse, and he's at the fair, and then, of course, from then on. Though, I guess with Christopher, the only thing I'd say is he kind of also had a lot of chances. I think it was very brutal, of course, with Tony. It was a very hard scene to watch. But in terms of, I guess, Christopher as a whole, if we're just looking at, like, from an objective standpoint, I think most people in Christopher's position wouldn't have survived as long as they did if it were not for the fact that he was...
He says that, too. He says, like, if it was anyone else, like, you would have, the first, time you used drugs, you'd be dead. And the show goes out of its way also to paint Christopher, too. Like, even the last thing he does before he dies, he kills JT Dolan for virtually no reason. I mean, he said, like, some people are like, well, he kind of told JT that he was thinking about ratting, and that's why he killed him. I think he was just lashing out.
Yeah, I think he was just drunk. I think he was just drunk and mad.
He was tired of being abused, and he's like, I'm going to take... Because he has JT beaten up a couple of times, too, just because he's weaker than him.
There was one theory I found about that one scene with JT that I found really interesting, because the whole time Christopher was trying to kind of...
He's trying to support.
He was going for support. He was trying to go over his life in the mafia and whatnot. And when JT says, Chris, you're in the mafia, I feel like I saw this one comment that said that Christopher killed him, as in they're like, okay, you think I'm in the mafia? You think I'm that guy? Fine. You think I'm that way? I'm going to be that way, and that's why he shot him.
Yeah, I think he was hurt. He felt like he wasn't getting support from JT, which... Why would you expect support from this guy who you, like, beat the shit out of, who you took his car, his money... But that's how these guys kind of are. They're like, that's just business. But now, like Tony always, like, trying to talk to his friends about his, like, when he didn't have Melfi, he's trying to talk to them about his dreams and stuff, and they're just bored with it.
Oh, yeah. And likewise with Tony. When they talk to Tony, whenever Angelo's trying to tell him, like, oh, I take my grandson to the park, and he's like, well, here we are.
He was always, it was so funny that he wanted to talk about his problems, but the second you brought up your problems, he's like, I don't got time for this. Like, these guys needed emotional support, which is the crux of the show, right? It's like the mob boss in therapy. And I think the show, it kind of changes after season 3 with the death of Nancy Mershad. It was originally much more about the family angle, about Tony growing up in this very toxic household, and his mother rubbed off on him, and his father too also. And then after her death, obviously the show goes in a slightly different direction, doesn't focus on that aspect as much, but I think that is the crux of it too, which is like it's a family drama of just an incredibly dysfunctional, toxic family.
Well, that's what David Chase wrote. He based Livia off of his own mother. In terms of the personality, which she reminded me of a couple other people I know too. I think we all know someone who reminds us of Livia.
Lovely.
Yeah, question?
Yeah, couple actually, and I was. Throw this one out there.
Yeah, sure.
When everybody went to Italy, right, the car operation, and obviously it kind of seems like the point when Christopher kind of got hooked up to the heroin.
Yeah.
Like, obviously you see Paulie out there, in the town, and obviously Tony's doing his own thing with the boss over there. It doesn't seem like anybody addresses why isn't Christopher anywhere over the duration of this entire trip, right? So, like, I know they said he was sick or whatever, but it seems like over, I don't know, let's say it was a week. It does seem odd, right, that nobody at any point called him out or said, "Hey, where's Christopher?" Or I guess, what are your thoughts on that in the sense of, like, why do you think that wasn't addressed?
Tony has a line where he's like, or I guess at the end there when Christopher's buying like a gift for Adriana, he's like, he had the whole trip to go buy something. I just think Tony was like busy with his own stuff. He was dealing with Annalisa. By the way, David Chase hates that episode, Commendatory. That's the one episode he doesn't like. He thinks it was indulgent for them to go to Italy. like they went to have like a vacation for themselves rather than like the pure artistic merit. He doesn't like that they cast Annalisa as this hot younger woman. They're like, it's not believable that this attractive woman would be the boss. So anyway, just an aside, I always find it interesting the episodes that the creators hate, because it's always like, I'm sure probably most people here like Commendatore. I love Commendatore. It's a great episode, but from his perspective, like I don't know if anyone here is Rick and Morty fans, but like Dan Harmon hates the Vindicator episode. And a lot of people really like that one, but it's just weird that the one that audiences gravitate towards is the one that he hates.
Can I answer a question?
Yeah.
Any questions? I don't know if this has anything to do with anything, but Christopher was not made at that point, so maybe that's why he wasn't at the dinner. I mean, I could be wrong.
Yeah, like when Polly's like, get some Imodium, you want to get made, this is no way to do it. So I think it was almost like they just sort of figured that like Christopher's slacking off, but he wasn't really like that important necessarily that he needed to be at any of these meetings. So it was kind of just like his own loss really for not.
Season 1 and 2, Christopher was very like the first episode, right? He's like, he didn't call the guy that Tony wanted, and Tony was cutting him a lot of slack because he's his little cousin. But yeah, definitely after he got made, then things started to get more serious for him.
Yeah, and then he got even more stressed, which is like ironic.
More into the
like,
heroin.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, keep going. Keep coming.
Sorry. And I appreciate this venue. This is great because I feel like my buddies don't want to hear me talk about this now.
That's why I started my channel, by the way. I don't know anyone in real life outside of, again, the people I've met through content creation who are into The Sopranos. Maybe they've seen it, but they're not trying to talk all the theories, which is why I thought it was so cool to have something like this where it's like, let's get into the nitty-gritty details of the show. So, keep on coming.
So, I guess one of them would be Jerry Torchiano, right? So he gets made, and then all of a sudden Phil basically says that he's the successor.
The hairdo, yeah.
Right, so how does it go from being an associate, obviously being made, and then within the same season, being basically the successor to be the boss, right?
I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about this, but I've always said that, like, I don't think the show is the most accurate portrayal of mob life. I think they try their best. Frank Renzulli, one of the writers from the first 3 seasons, one of the key writers of the season.
Fired.
Yeah, he might have quit. There was problems with him and David Chase, but he was the one who was like being really like knew all the stuff about the mob stuff, and he got angry at David Chase and was like, "This is not how these guys would act," and that's why he left after season 3. So. You could make the argument that maybe they just got some of those details. I've heard theories about like why maybe he was around for a while, but they just didn't open the books. You have something to say to that?
Yeah, there's a podcast out there called This whole nice and listen to every episode, and there's an episode with Frank in it. It was pretty upsetting.
Because then he wrote Funhouse, and they got the Emmy for that. And then I thought that David Chase fired him after.
No, that's Todd Kessler.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Really fascinating story. If you guys know about Todd Kessler, he joined. I did a video about all the writers, but he joined in season 2, same time as Boardwalk and Terrence Winter. Was praised he was like people were talking about him like he's one of the best writers. He co-writes Funhouse. He wrote the episode. David Chase wrote the dream sequence at the beginning. Todd wrote the second half where they kill Pussy. They get nominated for an Emmy. The day they get nominated for an Emmy, David Chase fires him. Gives him one more chance to write an episode in season 3, but basically he was kicked out. No one knows why for sure. People don't know if maybe he did something that annoyed Chase, or Chase didn't like that Todd was kind of the up-and-comer, of the show. But Todd would go on to create the show Damages. I don't know if you guys know that show. It was on FX. It was about a lawyer.
It was based on his relationship.
The lawyer, the main character played by Glenn Close, this ruthless lawyer who has this little protege who she kind of raises up and then betrays at the end. And people are like, this is autobiographical to Todd's experiences.
It's like Todd's Cleaver. It's Todd's Cleaver.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, just fascinating, behind the scenes stuff. But yeah, I just think that they just wanted to have Jerry get whacked by. They were setting up this plot with Doc Santoro, and then eventually that all plays out. So I just think they're not paying that close attention to all the mob stuff.
Yeah.
And it's just like, oh, we have this character here. Let's have him be the one to get shot in front of Syl. And again, they were tying it in, I think, to that whole, like, you don't even hear it.
Because then Syl right there, he's like, and the crazy thing was, I didn't hear what was happening until after the shot was fired.
So,
I always think of that.
It could also like just go towards the idea of, what was Phil's line in the penultimate episode. Like, it's all fucked up. There's no sword and gun on the table. Just this idea of like
guys get their finger pricked, even though they did.
I think there would even be a couple. I think one question someone asked was, in season 3, why is it that Eugene and Chris are being made at the same time when you would presume that Eugene would have been part of? I mean, granted, Chris probably got because he was like had a tight relationship with Tony. But I think someone mentioned that they always thought that was a little weird.
I think guys get made at the same time.
No, but I mean like in terms of how long they've been in.
Oh, I guess in that instance you could just assume that Eugene was around. You just didn't see him.
Because I know they knew. I know they grew up together in terms of like Eugene. So I guess he was around for a while.
Yeah.
But I know there's, speaking of the making, I get asked a question a lot about Bobby in terms of how did he get made without killing someone.
Yeah.
Which I assume my best guess would be, because his dad. But I don't really know how to answer that though in terms of like technically speaking.
And you can headcanon whatever reason you want. It's like New Jersey doesn't have standards like New York. Like you can come up with these reasons. I just think they weren't like they didn't concern themselves that much with being 100% accurate. It was more so like, how do we write the best stories we can, and that's where they succeeded, right?
Or the way like Ralph pops up in season 3 and he apparently is the head of the April crew, and everyone's like, "Who the fuck is this guy?"
in Miami.
They don't really like Richie and Ralph. Obviously, don't reference either of them.
Yeah, which is because they originally intended for Nancy Marchand to be.
Yeah,
so they had to write Ralph in as sort of like a new antagonist. But yeah, it is funny how everyone's kind of like. Granted, like we all know him. I don't remember my first experience watching the show. Like, we all know Ralphie now, he's a huge character, but just, like, objectively, when he shows up, you're just kind of like...
people comment how weird
he's, like,
he's just
hugging him, like...
It's like, you remember Bob last year.
I always thought, how Eugene wanted to go down to Florida to retire? I was like, why didn't he just say, like, hey, I'm going to go down there and run the business down there like Ralph did, and then just slowly distance yourself. Again, once Tony dies in the finale, you can kind of, cut ties a little bit more, and... I mean, it wouldn't have worked out anyway because the FBI wanted him, but yeah.
What do you think it was that Eugene got busted for where he had to cooperate? Because that was obviously never addressed.
I think it was his son's drugs.
Okay.
Because that's Carlo. The reason Carlo flipped at the end was because his son Jason got caught with drugs. We know Eugene's son had a drug problem, and that's like a constant theme of like the FBI using that leverage to like. Same thing with Adriana and Christopher. Adriana had her own problems, but
Adriana, only she'd had Neil Mink on speed dial. They could have really, really helped it. Or possibly even the thing with Eugene, maybe he got in trouble somehow for threatening the juror. Although they probably would have then been able to put that together and help him get Junior. So, but that's a good, that's an interesting topic in terms of the rats. Besides Adriana.
I think it was more so meant to just be like a shock thing. Like, oh, Eugene's a rat? And again, it's going back to this whole thing. They're all rats. Like, they're all ratting on each other all the time. And that, again, leads me to that little bit of Christopher, being a rat, because it's such a shock. But, they're just painting everyone as rats.
I'm very glad we brought up the Carlo son drugs, because going back to, like, my big theory on who killed him, does everyone remember? Because I think I brought it up to you, and I don't think you remembered it. Or, like, I almost had to rewatch it, because it's such a small scene in the finale. But I think everyone remembered. It's the scene where it's at Bobby's funeral. They're all sitting around the table. AJ's being all fucking, like, emo about, like, the war and everything.
Oh, crazy. He's like, y'all are living a dream.
There's the big conversation. And you guys remember, there's that one weird moment where, is it Patsy Jr.? Who's his son?
Jason. They're both called. David Chase has something against kids named Jason
Yeah.
because they're all
The
portrayed
other
as
Jason.
stupid. Yeah.
He got
The
in
Jason
some trouble.
who fucks up the gravestone. Anyway.
Jason Barone also.
Yeah, keep going.
Because one of the big holes in the theory that Patsy would have killed Tony or he had some hand in it, was that they were getting married. And so, like, why would he do that? But there's that one weird moment where they're all sitting around just talking, and right in the middle, it cuts to Patsy and his wife, and Patsy points at Jason, and he goes like this. He's like, get over here.
Yeah.
And Jason kind of goes like, what? And then he gets up and goes over, and then you can't hear what they say, but Patsy's kind of like scolding him about something. And this is right after, there's also another little moment during the scene where, at Bobby's funeral, when it's doing that panning shot over everyone talking about food, it ends on Carlo's son. And he says something innocuous, like, oh, look, Pa, they got fish.
Yeah.
And then Carlo comes up. And then right after, during the conversation, Patsy calls Jason over, and you don't hear what it's about. But, again, we're talking about this like the finale. This was very deliberately put in.
Yeah.
And so the theory is that when Carlo got caught up, or his son got caught up, is what caused Carlo to testify. Jason also got roped up, and somehow because they were always buddies throughout.
No,
the whole
they
thing.
say he's in trouble with some drugs.
Yeah.
That's why he wasn't invited to the house for the engagement
which
party.
that in itself, that scene was so
That
interesting in
little-
terms of and then even with Patsy, with Tony getting him a refill,
Yeah,
and then
so
with
pissed
Donna,
off about it.
and then she's looking up the china, like turning it over.
Yeah.
I like that in itself was a very sort of sketchy situation.
So I think the idea would be that Patsy, one of his motivations was that they killed Tony, because I think what they were afraid of is that Carlo would testify against Tony, but then Tony would turn around and, well, I'm the boss, I have all the information on everything.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like prevent that. And because again, and that ties in with the fact that Paulie was there when Tony met with the FBI agent, and they were already kind of getting a bit, or even goes back to when Tony beat up Harry in Mr. Sacramone.
Yeah.
You know, he did it as this sort of show of strength to, like, you know, I'm the boss again. And yet, if you look at his crew, they're all kind of like,
They're not impressed.
Like, what's this guy's
what the
crazy?
fuck is, he's going a little bit cuckoo now.
And we had a question.
Yeah, probably the main question I wanted to ask you, because I've heard so many different explanations of that scene, and it's like the one thing I don't understand myself really is it's all yours.
Oh, that's
Paulie,
in the bathroom.
Yeah,
There's
is that connected to this?
That is a big theory. So some people hand wave it and they say, well, what he meant was that Paulie was giving him the order to
Call the
guy to kill Phil at his house, which I think is it makes sense. It fits. But that was a very because again, you have to kind of consider how meticulous David Chase is in terms of. You know, that little short scene at the end of Members Only, or towards the end, when Vito just points out, Members Only jacket? When did you start wearing that? That was, my theory is that whoever that gentleman was at the end of the finale, Tony Shooter, my theory was always that he was some sort of relative of Eugene Petrikova. They kind of look alike. I mean, granted, a lot of the guys look alike. But
it's similar.
Wearing the same jacket. His wife
wanted to kill him.
Yeah.
You know, she wanted to
Literally
put a bullet in his head.
So that kind of, I presume, whoever wanted Tony killed, I presume Patsy and Paulie working together, they contacted a relative of Eugene to be like, hey, if you want revenge on this guy. Because I can't see any other reason. That was and the episode's entitled Members Only, where Eugene gets killed.
Yeah.
And I almost like the poetry of it where, you know, because Eugene hangs himself, and then the next scene is when Tony gets shot, goes through his dream, and then he tries to come out of it. I kind of like the poetic irony that even if Tony did, for whatever reason, come around at some point, his fate was already sealed. Yeah. With Eugene killing himself, sort of his relative or something, that was it was going to happen regardless whether or not he turned a new leaf.
I will say though, for all like and I'm not saying any of those details were not intentional. There is some stuff that like there's no necessarily reason. Like David talked about this on Talking Sopranos. He asked about like why Tony was carrying like a canned ham when he came back from the safe house. He's one of the things he's carrying, and David Chase is just like, I don't know. They just had a canned ham there, and it's like you could read so much into that about like
Virginia
pork or whatever connection there. But sometimes it's just something they're doing. Like also that scene where Tony is sitting in Carmela, they're eating in front of a mural at Satriale's. It's like the last shot, and David talked about that also in Talking Sopranos. He's just like, I just like the way they looked right there. It's like
with her sitting alone, like
sitting
isolated.
there, and he's just kind of nearby her. It's just like a nice like little moment where they're just eating there. So, and you could read meaning into that, but he's like the shot, So I'm not saying any of that stuff's not intentional, but I think we sometimes go so deep on this stuff where it's like, Bob or not Bobby. Steve's whole thing about the mayonnaise. Because there's a theory that the whole finale was a dream. Also, I mean, I think there's a theory also that Tony died in the beginning of season 6 and the rest of it was a dream. But I'm like, but you could then say that literally about everything. You could say the entire show is a dream.
No, sometimes that Tony died in season 1, and they're in the rest of the series. Like,
it was actually a heart attack in the pilot. It was not a panic attack.
I hate those theories that it was all a dream. People say the same thing about the Breaking Bad finale. Walt, died. It was all a dream, and it's like, then the whole show is meaningless.
Right.
Like, why have... I'm not saying dreams never happen, but, like, no.
And come on. I think the show was pretty adamant about the dream sequences being very out there, very weird and strange. So it was like, it's drawing a very parallel to how they operate.
Even the coma dream, which David said it's not a dream, it's like, Tony getting close to the afterlife, had a lot of surreal moments in it. That's like Buddhist. It wasn't. I mean, it was very much like realistic, but there was a lot of like the helicopter lights and stuff. So there's a lot of surreal things.
There are a lot of some. Oh, go ahead.
What do you think, like the fact of the Sopranos and the whole of serialized kind of aspect of television? What did you really think that really started showing effect? Because I started watching 6 Feet Under as a recent. I don't know if anyone here seen it.
I'm gonna watch that next.
Excellent! The finale will destroy you.
Okay,
that was my first. Even before Sopranos, that was like my first prestige drama show that I watched.
I want to talk about other shows a little bit, but you ask your question.
Yeah, I'm actually in the middle of season 4. I think the funny thing is, it started in 2001, which is before The Wire. I always saw The Wire as kind of like the second coming of like prestige TV.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Well, Oz was really the first.
Yeah. But The Wire, like, I think that's sort of the reason why it didn't take off when it aired. Each season is basically like one long episode. Like when you actually,
Is anyone here not seen The Wire? Doesn't want spoilers?
I won't.
We won't go deep into it, but it's a really good show.
But to Kino's point about sort of like you have something like Breaking Bad, which is a show where each episode ends with like
completely tied to each other. Yeah.
Or not only just that, but each ending is very a cliffhanger. Like very like a very dun 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 next episode. Whereas The Sopranos didn't do that. It kind of each one was sort of self-contained. The Wire was very interesting in that if you actually like think about The Wire, I actually almost consider doing this as an experiment. The Wire, the endings very rarely end off on some sort of like big climax. It almost just feels like any other scene. So and then same with like the openings of episodes. Very rarely do they open with any sort of like big like, duh, this is what's going to happen. It just feels like a continuation of. It almost feels like it's like one big 13-hour episode, but then of course you spread out each episode out by like a week, and the show is so dense you forget you forget what they're even talking about week to week. And I think that's why it picked up when people could like watch 3 or 4 in a row, or like over the course of 2 or 3 days, as opposed to like 3 months or something.
I wanted to ask this since we're getting on the topic of other prestige shows. The Wire is such a close second for me. Sometimes I almost think it's like tied with The Sopranos as being the greatest television show of all time. what other shows besides Sopranos? Because there's such a difference. Like some people gravitate towards like Breaking Bad, some people gravitate toward Mad Men. What do you guys like? What's your close second to the Sopranos?
The thing is that Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and Sopranos, that'll always be like Holy Trinity for me.
Yeah.
But the close sport that it had to be four was, I'd say, Mr. Robot.
Hell yeah,
He
bro.
loves Mr. Robot.
Hell yeah.
Were you like?
This would be my last one I had to use in there.
Okay, yeah.
But if I had to rank them, I actually seen Breaking Bad first. I thought that was always the best thing ever.
Oh yeah.
I watched Mad Men second. Oh, well, this is like the best character played.
Oh yeah.
And then I watched Sopranos. I'm like, oh, it's like up here.
Yeah.
I
Mad Men. You also have to credit that Matt Weiner learned from this. He was on the staff of Sopranos, so I do think Mad Men is number 3 for me. It's in terms of character, like I sometimes think Don Draper is more well written than Tony Soprano. Not to say Tony isn't the most incredible character ever, but like Don Draper, man, that's something else.
Also, this one.
Yeah.
Okay, there's this YouTuber named Jose. There's a lot of TV retrospectives.
Yeah.
Interested in history of TV, and he was talking about all the family of Archie Bunker is kind of like a close, distant cousin to Tony. I couldn't see that because like they're both like kind of men of their time.
Yeah.
Wait, literally they're cousins, or is he just saying they're?
They're like in the same
Spiritual.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I think that's another good example of a character who, like, we kind of, who's Ed O'Neill in, was it Married with Children? Yeah, there's sort of and like, you know, we can go to like Seinfeld or any sort of comedy, and this kind of connects back to Tony, where when characters do things in a show, or they behave a certain way, it doesn't really like sink in. Like, some of the stuff Ed O'Neill or even Archie Bunker said is probably like, if someone like said that in front of us, granted, like, you know, sensibilities have changed, but even so, we'd be like, holy shit, like, this person's, like, insanely racist or sexist or something. But when you're watching a comedy, and then you have the laugh track, it doesn't really, like, sink in. You're not really viewing the character as, like, oh, this is, like, a bad person. And just the point was to kind of bring it back to Tony as to why I think a lot of people may not have viewed him as harshly as, like, David Chase did. Where, like, when he was writing it, like, on paper, Tony, oh yeah, he's like a really, really bad, terrible person. But when you see it play out and the drama and the, you know, excitement, I think sometimes it doesn't really sink in. Same with sort of Archie Bunker. You're kind of like, when you actually like look at the stuff he says or stuff he does, you'd be like, holy shit, this person would be an awful human. But he's lovable. He's funny. It's kind of, yeah.
I think we all see a little bit of to one extent or another, like ourselves, you know, in Tony Soprano, whether, you know, not necessarily like, literally, but I think, and maybe in aspects of all the characters, which I think is what makes us, you know, relate to them, is maybe we'd never do any of the stuff that Tony does, but maybe we used to have panic attacks, or maybe we have our own, you know, fear of losing our family, or other sort of those struggles to find, you know, happiness, or like that great question, who am I, where am I going? Thank you. So I think that's also something that makes us relate, the fact that we can, you know, relate to them on some level that humanizes them.
I'm going to call you. You wanted to say something about the earlier. I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah. What do you think about Twin Peaks and David Lynch? Like,
Max should talk about Twin Peaks. I don't understand him. I'm just going to admit it. I don't understand it.
The reason I ask is because not long ago, a few years ago, there was a guy who was clearly like a film student, like this was like his PhD thesis. He had a 5-hour video, which was a unified theory for all the Twin Peaks, like seasons 1 and 2, Fire Walk with Me, and like the most recent one that came out like 2017. And I was like, okay, this is bullshit. And I watched it for like 20 minutes, and it actually made sense.
Oh yeah.
And like, it made me appreciate it that much more. And
Yeah.
I hated David Lynch for a very long time, but yeah.
I think there's something to be said about, it's this weird thing in culture where because when we're talking about like greatest movies or greatest, the example I used was if you look up Rolling Stone's top 100 guitarists, you know, it's the top 10 is usually like, you know, The Usual Suspect, Jimmy Page. Most people I think would say, you know, Jimi Hendrix. He's like the big one. However, if you asked Jimi Hendrix, I think they did. They said it was Terry Kath from Chicago, And I think he wasn't even on the list, which was a lot of people didn't like that. The point being that when we talk about like what is the greatest whatever, influence is a really big factor in that. Like, Citizen Kane is the most influential film, Godfather. Was Jimi Hendrix the greatest like technical guitar player? Probably not. The answer probably is some like Spanish maestro who is like an absolute killer on the guitar who no one has ever heard of just because. The reason I bring this up is because I think Twin Peaks sort of was in this weird spot where I think objectively Twin Peaks was the most like fundamentally influential show just in terms of being something you had never seen anything like that before. That was like, I mean, even to this day, we don't really see anything like Twin Peaks. We see a lot of copycats. We see things trying to be Twin Peaks. But that was a show that was like, what the fuck is this? But because it was so new, and granted, it wasn't a unpopular show. It was a very popular show. But I think it just got kind of lost in terms of people. When we're talking about influence, it kind of got lost in the shuffle because it was almost too, what's what I'm looking for, too new. Whereas then, I think around 10 years later, when The Sopranos came, that was when people were more receptive to it. It was more...
Yeah, like it was ahead of its time.
Almost too much so, where people kind of, like, it didn't really compute.
David said Twin Peaks was his favorite show and probably the biggest influence besides, like, The Godfather and Goodfellas, which are obviously influences too, but in terms of television, Twin Peaks was it.
It just kind of... That was the show that really revolutionized in terms of what you could do on TV, especially season 2. Because like season 1 for all of Twin Peaks is oddities. Season 1 was pretty standard in terms of it's about just like a murder mystery, small town America, uncovering the dark secrets, and then season 2 just goes off the fucking rails, and that's when you get like the Red Room and all the crazy ass shit. You can't even spoil that show because like.
It's just so bizarre. It wouldn't be able to conceptualize.
I can tell you the ending, and you'd be like, "Excuse me."
You had a question or comment?
Yeah. So about the like other great TV shows, I would say Sopranos is like my number 3. I think greatest TV show ever, basically ushered in the golden age of TV. My number 2 would be Breaking Bad. Not as layered or as complex as Sopranos, but in terms of like just straight up execution, like acting.
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree with that 100%.
Like cinematography, like direction, like to me it's the best. My personal number 1 though would be BoJack Horseman. Just because I think like all 3 of those shows have a very interesting approach to like characters and change. Like Sopranos to me is kind of about a character's like inability to change. Like it's like a straight line. Breaking Bad is kind of the decline of the character. BoJack to me goes like this. We see him like mess up, make improvements, mess up again, and then it's like to me like it's a very like accurate portrayal of like humanity, even though it's a show about like animals.
I know, Court. I've never seen BoJack Horseman, but I know that they reference The Sopranos, and they reference David Chase and stuff too, right?
I
know that joke at the end where he's directing like one of the shows, and so it's obviously. I think they had something about like. Didn't the guy mess up the finale of The Sopranos? That's why he cuts to black.
I think I do remember.
Yeah, so it's like they're obviously like very much inspired by The Sopranos too.
Yeah. I also wanted to piggyback on the earlier conversation about like why like audiences kind of gravitate towards like really messed up characters.
Yeah.
I think like at least like for me like the biggest explanation for that is the acting. Like I think
absolutely.
Yeah, because Breaking Bad, like their writers' room have like kind of that same confusion with the audience that David Chase has. Like we purposely wrote like Walter White to be a piece of shit, but like they're like why do I want to like him? I think it's because like Bryan Cranston is such a great actor. Same thing with
absolutely.
James Gandolfini, like they're good at like capturing like these different emotions of being like a human, and like it's easy to like relate to that.
Yeah.
So, but I think The Sopranos more than any other show is good at like reminding the audience like like bad these characters are. And, like even like its approach to like violence. I don't know if you guys feel this way too, like if you look at like any violent scenes, Sopranos, like it seems like it's purposely like awkward and abrupt, like repulsive to look at.
Oh yeah,
not
like,
stylized at all.
Yeah, like even the scene with like Ralphie, like you hate this character so much, like that scene where he's just like bashing his head.
Yeah.
Like, it's like so weird. Like ugh.
I felt badly. I can't help but feel badly for Ralph. I know it's weird. I also don't think he killed Pyamar.
He's the one character who gets sort of a redemption before he dies.
But he doesn't get it.
You'll notice this: every other character who dies, they do something horrible right before they die to remind you why they deserve it. Vito kills that guy he ran into with the car. Pussy runs over some guy, while he's trying to be an FBI agent.
7-Eleven clerk.
Ralphie is the one guy who they're like, oh no, he's actually, because he was so bad before that they almost had to go the opposite direction, where he's kind of reforming. I mean, you could say it was, all an act, but
we didn't know. I think that's what makes it like you wanted. You almost like you wanted to see like what would have happened. Like would he have actually turned over a new leaf? And I mean. You could say probably not, but maybe.
I hate that David Chase just said what the answer was about.
And it's not true. I was fortunate enough to a couple years ago, two friends of mine, they bought me a cameo from Joey Pants, and he told me that he'd played it like he did not kill Pyamar. And so, and to be honest, I think that kind of goes back to and I wouldn't expect David Chase or someone to necessarily remember every single little detail, but I would trust more of that particular actor in terms of their memory of what they were.
I heard that he didn't tell him either way, and then Joey chose to play it like he didn't do it. Now, maybe you could say in David Chase's head it was always that he did it, but I like the ambiguity because it's not really about whether he killed the horse.
It's about Tracy.
It was about Tracy. It was about all the other stuff Ralph had done. He finally exploded. And Tony took it out on him, and that's why I don't like just the direct answer.
Because I feel like that's sort of the antithesis of The Sopranos.
Yeah.
Like
There's
direct
no
answers and closure, and like things being tied up in neat little boxes, and like that's really that's not really the Sopranos. But
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think it's interesting. You point out something. What's really interesting about. Because I think one of the reasons we're all into stories, or the reason we sort of are drawn to them, especially like, granted there's like sort of this big divide between like, modern storytelling, which is really, I would say, like postmodern storytelling. This idea of we're more drawn to stories of redemption, or people doing good things, or just changing in some way.
Yeah.
What's really ironic about The Sopranos is that its view of change is almost, I don't want to say pessimistic, but it's very like, because like how many epiphanies does like Tony have throughout the show? Like he kind of, you think he's going to come around and then he backslides, and then he kind of makes progress, but then he backslides. And the reason I bring it up is because one flaw that I've heard many people point out, which I think it was very deliberate, was Ralphie's change of heart after his son was injured with the arrow, where a lot of people I just don't buy this idea that this awful person could all of a sudden turn over a new leaf. But I think that was almost it was very deliberately done in the sense of showing how, we like to think that human nature is, you make mistakes, but then you learn from them, kind of like on sitcoms. But very rarely, I think, is that, sadly, that's not really the truth. People they make mistakes and they justify them to themselves and they keep going. I think the point Ralphie was trying to make was that, or his turn of his character was that sometimes it takes this, unprecedented, very shocking, traumatic event that can just completely change you as a person. Because I think there's even a couple of jokes in that episode where Tony almost kind of gets uncomfortable. I have to remember.
He sort of sabotaged Ralph. He told Ralph when Ralph comes in that was when he was seeing Valentina, and then literally at the very end he says, "Why don't you go see Pie of mine?" To Ralph. It was almost like he was almost baiting him, and I think that Tony didn't like to see the success of others. Even with Janice, remember with how's Harpo's? What do you think Harpo's doing for his Sunday dinner? And I think that's it was more for his own self-loathing, but because if they got better, then what's his excuse?
Isn't that all very relatable? I feel like that's the writing and acting of this show makes very bad people
Well, Dave was very also critical of like therapy as a which is funny considering that's the core of the show. But he always said that he didn't think people change from therapy. You just do it for a while and then you stop.
Right.
Now, he obviously had experience with therapy. That was kind of the impetus behind the show. I think that is very relatable. That like, how many of us have said, we're gonna change, we're not gonna do this bad stuff anymore, and then maybe you change a little bit, but a lot of times it's not as dramatic as a lot of shows make it out to be. You're kind of the same.
Or maybe you don't even realize you're changing. Like with Meadow, sort of how like by the end it was she was the one. She was cynical their first dinner. It's like Mario Cuomo, and then by the end she's telling Tony about all the Italian American restaurant. Even Tony's like skeptical, but I don't think Meadow would have necessarily thought in that moment, oh, I really changed. I think it was just sort of the circumstances and everything that led to. She kind of sort of just like settled with that and kind of just sort of rationalized it that way.
Or with Carmela in the last season, how you kind of almost get this hint that she's going to Adriana's deaf. She doesn't know for sure, but she starts to kind of look into it. She starts to ask too many questions, and we almost think that maybe this will be her kind of coming out of it. But then Tony gets her a new car, and they get to the spec house, and all of a sudden it just kind of goes away.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah, and I think, or to your point, I think what was so, I do agree where I think The Sopranos is a very like relatable show, but not in the sense that people want to admit it. Because I think most people like to think themselves of like, oh yeah, I'm a person who I make mistakes, but I learn from them and I grow. But I think the dark truth is a lot of people do sort of see this idea of, oh, I thought about changing and then I woke up and I just did whatever I did the next day. It almost like they do relate to it, but they don't tell anyone that. They're not honest about it. They're like, I hate that I see myself in this character almost in a way. Yeah.
We had a question, maybe comment?
I was curious about, did y'all ever watch House at all?
I love House.
Yeah, because I found the same sort of like ebb and flow of like the struggle to get better, but not quite getting there, and like falling for grace again.
People, they talk down about like case of the week type, like procedurals, like Law and Order and stuff. They're very House is like that. It's very predictable, but for being a procedural, had one of the most interesting character writing in terms of House. Now, granted, are a lot of the other side characters not as developed? Sure. But in terms of House, like I put him up there with all the greats of the critical, like, the Don Drapers, the Tony Sopranos. Like, that was a fascinating character. So I love House, Same arc for me.
I think, I just want to go back because I think you asked a question earlier, and I think I may have pivoted to it. I think what your question was going to be was, Sopranos was kind of known for being the show too. And again, you were talking about Twin Peaks. I really think Twin Peaks was the forebringer of this sort of like hyper-serialized television. But I think what your question was going to be was that Sopranos kind of, it perfectly balanced or even revolutionized, ushered in the era of serialized storytelling. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your question was going to be kind of like, when did the show sort of like get its groove in terms of that? Yeah, I would say, because rewatching season 1, very episodic, extremely. Season 2, a little bit. For me, I think season 3 is kind of where, and I kind of flip-flop between season 3 and 4 being my favorite season, because I think season 3 was sort of you started to see, because season 4 is known as like when the show changed. That was when it kind of grew up. It got darker.
9/11, yeah, I think that was like the dividing line.
But I think season 3, if you rewatch it, that was, because season 1 and 2, even season 2 is great, but still very almost, I don't want to say slapstick, but there is the comedic aspects of it are very lighter, whereas in season 4, it's very dark. Whereas season 3 is where the transition kind of happened, where, it is very humorous, there's a lot of humor, but then it also has Tracy that has
and all of a sudden they have Melfi, then another toothpick, then University. They have like 3 really like super violent episodes in a row. I think
it was really
that.
You know what's so funny when people bring up that like The Sopranos like ushered in this era of like highly serialized television? I've always found that like weird because The Sopranos is not really serialized.
It
like it's that's what I love so much about the show, and I love Breaking Bad too for exactly the reason you said. Like, is it as deep? Maybe not, but it's so perfectly executed. The pacing is so like entertaining, and I think it's a show that did that perfectly. But I always felt Breaking Bad was the show that really ushered in this era of like every episode has to be connected. Each episode has to lead into the next one with a cliffhanger and stuff. And I always appreciate that Sopranos didn't really do that. It kind of like you can kind of just throw on any episode of The Sopranos and just watch it. Like, will there be occasional story elements that connect? But yeah, but not because again, David Chase was much more into the movie world where that wasn't a thing. So.
Well, I think it was like almost like a transitional period where it kind of was, it walked the tightrope between, because like I said, like you have the Twin Peaks and The Wire, but that hyper-serialized storytelling almost didn't grant itself that well to weekly television. Even Breaking Bad was a show that really didn't take off until it was put on Netflix.
That's true.
And I think it was because this idea of like, hey, I love it, but having to wait a week between each episode,
you forget what happened.
I think we all kind of get that, where watching a show week to week versus binging it in like maybe one or two sittings, it does have a different effect on you. I think Absolutely. It can affect you.
We had a comment here.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna comment on what you were saying. I'm like one of the weird people. Like season 1's actually my favorite. I don't know, like for the I know it's a little episode, but to me, like that felt like the most like from start to finish like story arc was about Tony and his conflict with his mother and his uncle coming coming together. Every other season after that kind of feels like episodic, but in a good way.
Yeah.
Every what you're saying again, every episode kind of feels like its own little short film.
Yeah.
Which I really appreciate about the show. But I do agree with you. I think the show does kind of hit that balance in season 3 and kind of figures out exactly what it is. And I know the show has a lot of it explores a lot of different things throughout the series. But for me, I think the main theme, which I think season 3 hammers on, was that complacency of evil, that casual everyday evil in the show. Because there's a lot of dark moments in season 3, and it bounces that humanity really well. And I think for me the most emblematic scene in the entire show is in Pine Barrens. It's the scene where Paulie and Christopher are out in the woods.
Yeah.
And Christopher thinks that Paulie's setting him up and he holds him at gunpoint.
Yeah.
And Paulie's like, "You think after all this, I'll really try to kill you?" And Christopher looks him dead in the eyes yeah, I do. To me, that's what the whole show is about. It's yes, don't forget these characters are gangsters and sociopaths.
People forget, because Pine Barrens is such a funny episode, people forget that it's there's actually, a lot of, character moments in that episode, besides just being a funny and entertaining episode. We're seeing, the conflict between Paulie and Tony. We're seeing the conflict between Tony and Gloria. That's when it really comes to a head in that episode. There's a lot more, again, people love that episode because it's so funny, but there's a lot more to it than just these two guys are lost in the woods.
Right, but that's something that's also great, captain or no captain, whatever your status is, right now we're just two assholes lost in the woods. So it's whatever, for all intents and purposes, our status, doesn't matter right now, whatever, if there's some, we might freeze to death, it doesn't matter for Capo, what our ranking is, we're just as vulnerable as anybody else right now.
Skipping to that episode, what happened to Paul's car and his barely dead?
You guys want to answer that?
I mean, in terms of the car, I think that might be one of those, we don't really have a specific explanation for it, but it just happened.
I think it doesn't matter. I think that was David's whole point with that. He talks about that with the ending in some of these other episodes where it's when he wrote Pussy out at the end of season 1, he had no plans to bring him back. And he was surprised that people were where's Pussy? What happened with him? He's just oh, I guess I didn't even think about it. He's just gone. And then he wrote, obviously, season 2. I think that David doesn't think in terms of, again, going to the fact that The Sopranos is not this hyper-serialized thing where, in another show, Valerie would come back and he'd be the season 5 antagonist and they set him up or whatever, and it's he didn't care. And Terrence Winter talked about it in an interview where they're like, he was going to bring Valerie back, and you were going to see like half of his head like missing where they shot him, and he was going to be brain dead, and that's why he didn't remember what happened. And he brought that up to David Chase, and he said, oh, the audience is going to love this. And then David said, okay, then don't do it then. Because for him, it's not about giving the audience what they want. It's not about cheap entertainment. He's like, if that's what they want, don't give it to them. Like, let's challenge them more than this. So there is no answer. Like, again, people are like, he climbed up a tree and the Boy Scouts found him and he got him back to Russia or whatever. And it's like, it's not that kind of plot-driven show where it's just like, it's just something that happened. And there's character consequences. Like, this is where we see the relationship between Paulie and Tony start to fall apart, and that's going to be a big thing moving forward. But in terms of like what actually happened to him, there is no answer because they didn't write it.
Because you could also say, well, what was Slava? Like, you could think about that. Like, he was Slava's best friend, someone who thought it was like a brother's. Like, Slava just never thought to like go, where's my friend? I think there's some things that they kind of just didn't fully explain. I also think of like how Furio, another in terms of like how would that happen logistically? How Furio's house was like empty the next day when he supposedly went back to Italy. Yeah. That's all just in one other random example of something. I'm like, if we thought more about the logistics of that, like, that's kind of, weird just how quickly that turned around and his house is completely empty and put on the market the next day after he flies to Italy.
And people are like, how did he leave, like, Tony's service? Because you can't just quit, And
some people think he was killed.
Yeah, but it's like, it's just, it's more so just about Carmelo's reaction.
Mm-hmm. Since we're talking about Furio, I want to add one of my theories of the ending. I do attest to what you said about Eugene. That's one of my theories, too, of how Eugene's family members could have been in on killing Tony. I think Furio could have been in on killing Tony at the end. Possibly. And in the episode where he goes back to Italy, for his dad, he's like, you have to kill this guy if you ever want her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And with the conflict in New York in the end, they're getting the Zips to go kill Philly Otardo. That means they're still in contact with Annalisa and the crew. Furio would know that something's going on. Maybe this is to strike the time to hit Tony.
Yeah.
And Furio wants Carmela if he's in love with her that much. And at the end, Tony dies. Furio, like maybe months after that, he goes in, the music's playing in the background, and Carmela gets her like 20 moves.
That would be I mean, Carmela, I feel like by the end, she was so checked out. Like, even when she was like, when Christopher dies, when she gets the call and like she fell asleep in her laptop, it was like she was looking at properties in like Panama City Beach. I feel like there were just a lot of things that really just like lead me to think that Carmela was just totally checked out by the end. Even the finale, she's the meeting with carpenters. That's why she didn't want to cook. Like lots of stuff like that.
I think to your point about the Pine Barren ending, and I think this was, I personally chalk it up more to, because like there are a lot of just like kind of character drop plot lines, stuff like that. But I think the Pine Barren ending was really deliberate in the sense of, because like one of the other big themes of the show is this idea of like, it's always out there. There's a really small moment that I always love for James Gandolfini, his acting. It's in college when he's got Fabian, he's choking him, and Fabian tells him, I could have killed you last night. And then, because earlier we saw that he almost did, but then a couple came. And if you rewatch it, James Gandolfini does this great thing where he almost looks he's got this fear on his face where it's this idea of the fact that like, thinking back, he was right there and he almost could have killed me in Meadow, but I didn't even realize it. And this fits really well within, as the show goes on, Tony becomes so paranoid. Mm-hmm. And then you think about it like, you have Furio out there, you have the Russian, it's this idea of him constantly digging his own grave of, even if nothing ever happens to him, like again, I think he dies at the end, but the idea that even if he didn't, he would just be living this horrible life of paranoia. Or there's that one scene where he pulls his car up and then
I think he thinks it's Christopher coming after him. Every time he walk like a man.
And then he grabs the sonic shotgun.
And it's AJ.
It's supposed to show this very just like constantly on edge. I actually, funny enough, because that is one thing that I contend with the ending, where a lot of people, one of the theories as to why Tony doesn't die, or one of the theories against it, is that it's just supposed to signify that it's always out there, that he's just going to live this very paranoid life. However, I would actually argue that in the ending, that final scene, I almost think Tony is characterized as almost too, at least for me, like rewatching it, he almost looks like he's like Carmela in a way. He's almost checked out. He isn't doing this. He's almost kind of just like,
yeah, sort of just like whatever, like
he's lost. He realizes Carlo's, gonna rat on him. Everything in his life is still a mess. It's almost like he's kind of resigned himself to giving up on the life. That even connects to the idea that if Meadow had come in and told him that she was pregnant, maybe that would have been his final straw to finally turn around and just be done with it. That would have been kind of Ralphie's. That would have been an epiphany moment of finally having the granddaughter or grandson. That would have been what finally woke him up, and the dark irony of him. Because that was another thing too. When Meadow's running into the restaurant, she looks very agitated. But this is a very small detail, but she isn't kind of like I'm just going to dinner with my family. She's like kind of racing in, looking very concerned. And the dark irony of that would have been it. That would have been the moment where everything turned around. But then,
like how it goes, it's like a callback to the like in season 2 when she talks about how she passed her driving test, and she's like, I had a hard time parallel parking, but the guy was like a dork with the clipboard, and then it just like it's funny then when it goes back to that in the end, and then another thing really quick about the paranoia that I wanted to touch on, not about Tony, but remember Melfi's date in Meadowlands, who he got all paranoid after Makazian beat him up. And then he's sitting there, and the way that he describes to Dr. Melfi his paranoia, he's like, I was in a donut shop and a guy in a booth looked at me and I got afraid and ran away. It reminds me of Holston's. And he even says, like, this song came on and it wasn't Don't Stop Believing, but it was like the situation that he describes, it reminds me of Holston's later on.
I forgot about that parallel parking thing with Meadow. That's a interesting connection. And
also the way in the season 3 finale when she runs across the street, when she's like, "This is such bullshit," runs across the street. It visually reminds me a lot of the finale where she's running across the street.
I think that's a deliberate callback. I think it is, because that's her running away from her family. That's when she's like rejecting their life, and then she obviously we talked about it, she turns it around and she's kind of embracing it almost, which Tony's kind of unhappy about. He always wanted her to leave them. Mm-hmm. Like, he says that to Melfi, like, she needs to get as far away from me as possible. Obviously I don't think he meant it quite literally, but I think that's why she said, Melfi tells him why he tells her that he gave her Eric's car. Because he wanted her to hate him, so she would leave them and not be I think subconsciously, like he wanted her to get away from their family and how toxic and horrible it is.
He didn't even realize he was doing it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that's another little tidbit. Obviously, the video I did on Sopranos, I talk about how I think people there's the scene in Cold Cuts where Tony antagonizes Janice into melting down over Harpo. A lot of people read that scene in a really weird way to me. They think it was like, oh no, Tony was like, to me that was very obviously Tony seeing that Janice was trying to improve herself.
Yeah,
he couldn't have the shit. A lot of people sort of frame it as like, oh no, he knew that it was bullshit and was trying to like reveal. It was like they're trying to like frame it in a really weird way to.
Yeah, I don't.
I said this in one of my videos, and people were like, "That's not true." I said, like, if you're acting nice, you are nice. And then people were like, "No, that's not true." Like, but it's like that was the whole point. She wasn't causing trouble in their family, he was like they'd always
she was getting
done.
better.
Yeah.
Whether you argue whether it was bullshit or not, like if you're not like screaming at people, if you're not causing problems, that's a good thing. And I think he couldn't stand that.
That's even how anger management actually works. It's not this idea of like, oh, you stop being angry one day. It's that when you get put in situations that usually trigger you, you're able to control yourself, and then that keeps happening and happening and happening, and then eventually, maybe years down the line, you realize you're not snapping at some chick who's yelling at you at your daughter's soccer
That was a
game.
funny scene, by the way, when they were in anger management, and then Janice starts going on Janet.
That's one of the episodes. That's one of the only few episodes. I can only remember two that had a credit scene like play over footage. Like For All Debts Public and Private, the season 4 opener has that thing with the dollar bill. And this episode, it has that montage of like, I'm not like everybody else. And it's, that's kind of like a badass kind of song, like I'm not like everybody else type thing, but I think it's also meant to be like, yeah, you're not like everyone else because you're a piece of shit.
Yeah.
Like,
the regular people actually try to.
He walks out of the thing and like again, the music kind of sounds like a little bad, like he's walking away triumphantly, but I don't think that was the message of that episode.
It was more like he wanted to bring everyone else like down with him, not because he didn't feel better about himself after doing that. He just. It's also funny with the
He wanted Janice to not do that stuff too. He tells her like you're causing problems for me, and then when it actually happened, same thing with Christopher too. He wanted him to be sober, but when he got sober, he resented it, so he undermined it. So
I also love how when did that happen? Like 30 seconds into dinner, that scene, and then he just gets up and leaves.
Yeah,
like they spent all this stuff cooking, and then he's just like,
and she's crying at the end, and like Bobby's like,
and she's going to the fork. I like how that reminds me of the whole like stick a fork in your eye. Like it was specifically like the fork. She was.
They have their parents' temper 100%.
Sorry to connect it back. I think what really bugs me, because you put it perfectly. I think what really bugs me about some people's reading of Meadow is they read her in a very what's her looking for? Almost like uncharitable light in the sense of they'll point out the numerous times throughout the show where she's kind of a hypocrite. Probably the biggest one is at the end of season 3, where she's really against Tony for what they did with Jackie Jr. But then when Jackie's sister calls her on it, you're talking about an outsider. You're talking to an outsider about this, and it's really. And then in season 4, when she starts to kind of go through her depression and she calls Tony out, Mr. Mabas.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird where people sort of frame it as almost like, oh, she's being a petulant brat. She's, being hypocritical. It's like, well, no, it's like she's a teenage girl who's starting to, have to face the fact that her father's probably, a murderer and a criminal, and her entire life is based on all these things. It's just very strange how people sort of frame it as if, she's ungrateful or, weird.
The way people attack the kids in general, AJ and Meadow, it's so weird. It's like, how do you expect kids who were raised in this environment, not just the mob stuff, but people criticize AJ because he's a spoiled brat. Who spoiled him? Yeah. Tony and Carmela,
and they got him out of every situation.
He's failing. He buys him a new car.
He buys a new car.
How do you expect him to not be this spoiled bratty kid when that's who his parents are?
And they had so much in common. Even in the second coming, when they open the episode and they show Tony and AJ back and forth, both sort of rolling around in bed, depressed, and it's they.
Literally, AJ and Tony are the exact same characters. Just AJ's not in the mob. They have parallel lines of dialogue where in therapy Tony's like, why can't we all just get along? AJ says that exact same line when he's in therapy. They're both depressed. Tony even says right before he goes and kills Matthew Bevilacqua to AJ, he's like, I see myself in you. That's why I get so angry at you. So everyone's like, oh, AJ's a wimp, and it's just he doesn't have the outlet of the mob like Tony does.
That also is when we're talking about scenes that we relate to that we don't want to admit that we relate to. What's that scene where AJ is at his computer giggling?
Oh yeah,
and then Tony kind of just walks over and just looks at him in disgust and then walks away. And it's yeah, it's probably what when I told my father I was going into film, he probably was okay, it's probably similar.
You're not going to get into Strasbourg State that when she was that.
It's so sad. We're about to hit 8 o'clock here, and we'll wrap it up. But what's so sad to me about how much they undermine AJ, in season 2, when they're talking about what college he wants to go to, he says he wants to go to West Point, and Tony says you'll never get in there. The next season, when they're talking about college again, he's like, oh, AJ, you want to go to West Point, right? And AJ's like, no, I don't. And it's this the second he tried to have some kind of ambition, they undercut him. They're like, you're not going to get, they undermined him, they put him down, and he learned not to even reach for stuff like that. It's like, it's played very humorously, but that's a very sad scene for me.
Sort of like at how there's a switch at the end where the beginning, like, you'll remember the good times, and then at the end, AJ's like, oh, remember the times were good?
And
I
Tony
said
can't
that.
remember that line.
And also, the just woman about that when he said, you want to go to that college, you got to crack the books. I love how then it immediately transitions to them trying, Matt McLaughlin, Sean trying to crack the safe.
Yeah.
So it kind of made me think of, like,
I just wanted to add about AJ is, although it seems ironic how Meadow is shown as the smart one all throughout the show, getting straight A's and getting into Columbia. Thank you. It's kind of funny how AJ is the almost one that's almost separating himself, sort of like Barbara did, as he's the one kind of just getting the fringe benefits of the mob, but working under Carmine, who's also just really not under any pressure, who kind of decided to step down. So it almost seems like AJ was kind of this figure who, although was shown like to be not intellectual there, but he was sort of like emotionally smart, was how Carmine with and Carmine was also Carmine Jr. being always shown as like, receptive to
like it wasn't about
Christopher's sobriety and all that.
I think AJ was though like smart and talented in a way. Like he throws those parties and they make a bunch of money. He wants to go out decides to go out for football. Like he's like this, not the star of the team, but he's like the coach. Like you're really good. Like he had talents, they just weren't ever encouraged, and like it was undermined for him. And he was depressed, just like Tony was. And he just had a bunch of emotional problems that they just weren't really equipped to deal with.
And by then he was the only one that was like willing to face the reality. Also, and he's like, "Yo, living a dream world."
Yeah, I mean, he learned all about like EVs again. Like it's like a meme, but like he was interested in stuff. He's interested in politics and Middle Eastern stuff, and like he wanted to go into the army, which I don't know, maybe would have been good for him. Like and maybe would have been bad too, but. They're like, we don't want you to do that. We got you this cushy job. We're gonna buy you a new car, and they undercut him every chance they got.
Yeah, they talk to him like he's like a joke. The whole family, even to where the DeAngelis is stuck up for him. Like Jesus, Melly, when Costa there.
Yeah,
there's probably maybe the dark. Because I never really saw it like this, but someone pointed out to me, and I think it is. And this just goes to show how good the writers got at their extremely dark, like, undercutting humor. It's after AJ tries to commit suicide, and then Tony comes home with a very, heart-wrenching scene where he starts, like, consoling him, and then it cuts to the hospital, and, AJ's in the wheelchair, and they're pushing him through, and then Meadow and Tony and Carmela are there, and they're all distraught, and they're like, we're going to take care of him. And then Carmela breaks down and she goes, "He was always so happy." And everyone's like, "No, he fucking wasn't." No. At no point in the show.
He was the sweet one. Remember she says that in season 5.
It's almost this dark thing and it goes back to this idea of like, this narrative that they built in their head of like, no, he was a happy boy. And then you rewatch it, you're like, no, he wasn't. He was always, or even, I think in the last season, Meadow had to like, be the one to be like, you guys realize he's like, very, very depressed and might do something, and they're kind of like, he's fine, he'll shake it off.
Yeah, Carmela's no rage. When she heard Meadow was going to California, she was like, which that's a whole interesting thing itself.
We hit 8 o'clock here, so I want to thank you all for coming. I don't know, I'm down to stick around for a little bit, ask questions. I'm going to stop recording here. But if anyone has to leave or whatever, I totally get it. But I just wanted to say, while the camera's still rolling, thank you all for coming to this. It was a lot of fun to discuss the show with you. And we'll stick around for a while and keep talking.
Sounds good.
But yeah, thank you so much.
So now that the camera's off, we can